India was one of the most developed regions in the world in the 18th century. It was richer than either Europe or China. India has some of the most fertile land in the world, a large population, and a hub for trade between Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia. It has almost everything it needs within its own borders. If India was an industrialized country like in North America, Western Europe, or East Asia, its economy would be about $80 trillion, about the same as the entire world economy in 2020. So how is it possible that in only 250 years, India went from the wealthiest region in the world to one of the poorest regions in the world?
Ask any Indian, why is India so poor? They will invariably give you the same answer. Overpopulation, illiteracy, British rule, corruption, and equality between rich and poor. But are these really the factors behind poverty in India? And is India really that poor today? Let's find out. It's true that India lost its position as one of the great trading areas of the world and was a poor country after British rule. But to put the blame squarely on the shoulders of the British is to give a tiny minority in charge of a minimal state a little too much credit. The real culprit in my view were market forces which tilted during colonial era to favor the West. After Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire began a slow decline. Political instability is never good for the economy. During that time, local warlords became very powerful. As a result, bankers and merchants focused more on giving loans to these warlords instead of investing in merchants and trade for income. India was largely an agricultural country with small urban areas where specialized and increasingly out of business artisans served the declining aristocracy. Sea trade flourished but was dominated by a wealthy caste and family-based companies who could afford to build ships. However, they couldn't compete with European joint share companies which could mobilize more capital and spread the risk among far more shareholders. The vast majority of the Indian population scratched out a hard existence in the agricultural hinterland. Interestingly, Europe was not far ahead either. European population was also largely poor and the economy was based on agriculture and trade. Europe did have a couple of small industries, but they were mostly labor intensive. All of this was about to change. As industrialization took off in Europe, the cost of labor decreased and the productivity increased. For factories to become more profitable, cheap raw material was needed, which thanks to limited land in Europe wasn't easily available. At this point, Asian and African colonies became super important to European empires, and India with its huge land and massive agricultural population was to become a jewel in the British crown. The Mughals had up to this point kept the British limited to a few ports in India, enabling Indian handicraft industries to survive. All that changed as the empire declined and Britain gradually became the premier European power in India. Existing institutions were reshaped in its own favor, investment in public goods began to take off and a uniform currency was introduced. The revenue rights on the agricultural land was renegotiated with zamindars and local landlords. Most importantly, as India was forcibly opened to global market, British joint stock companies and railroads finally penetrated to the agricultural hinterland and connected supply of cheap raw material from India with demand of industries in Europe. So Britain began to leap ahead, buying ridiculously cheap raw materials, processing them in factories, and selling finished goods across the world. India was especially a captive market for British companies. The profits fueled investment in their industrial technology and productivity increased as British agricultural workers moved to industrial jobs. Meanwhile, increasingly unemployed Indian artisans in handicraft industries returned to agricultural jobs since the demand for agricultural raw material was so huge. Thus began the deindustrialization of India. From 1860s to 1920s, industries continued to become more productive as they were only constrained by technology, and so European workers eventually achieved better standards of living as their economies boomed. Agriculture, however, cannot indefinitely become more productive as land is limited, and as a primarily agricultural nation, rural India quickly hit peak productivity and stagnated. So Indian workers continued to remain in poverty. Global trade increased in volume, but India's handicraft industries had lost their workers to the stagnant agricultural pool and it was unable to take advantage of this trend. With an economy that was stuck in the dead end, it's not really a surprise that India fell behind Europe. One could say that the cards were really stacked against it, and so India's premier position in global trade was lost. But did globalization really do nothing for India? It did. By the turn of 20th century, India's urban centers like Bombay did industrialize a bit. Bombay had many small cotton mills, but with scarce capital, lack of technical expertise and absence of sizable skilled workforce, Indian industries simply could not compete with Europe. Post-independence, India adopted socialist policies. Due to the lack of funding in research, India could not develop technologies faster for manufacturing and agriculture. During that period, China invited global companies to set up manufacturing and learned about their technologies by reverse engineering. Correcting earlier mistakes, India opened its economy in 1991 and it grew at a rapid pace.
Command type of economy was not as secure as we had thought. Therefore, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major factor which influenced thinking on economic reforms in our country as in other countries. Our foreign exchange reserves when I took over were no more than $1 billion, that is roughly equal to 2 weeks imports. The economy turned around much sooner and much more deeply than I had anticipated. Indian industry boomed. We created record number of jobs. We were able to control inflation and the economy was growing at the rate of 7% per annum.
In current decade, India has become the fastest growing major economy in the world. In spite of this development, India still has widespread poverty. As per United Nations MDG program, 22% Indians live under extreme poverty by earning less than $1.25 a day, and as many as 58% Indians earn less than $3.1 a day. There are a lot of myths about reasons behind poverty in India, so let's bust them before we move on to the real reasons of poverty. Israel, South Korea and Netherlands have high population density compared to India, but these countries are highly developed. Large population is not really a reason for poverty, it's not a solution either. If Indian markets could evolve faster and technologies were able to create jobs in new fields, then population would become an engine of growth. Poverty breeds corruption. All the advanced economies had high corruption at one point, but as they progressed economically, corruption amongst general population came down. It's a myth that development happens after the corruption is rooted out. On the contrary, corruption comes down after the development has happened. To prevent corruption, you need better institutions, strong checks and balances, and more transparency in public spending. All this happens as the economy strengthens. Inequality is undesirable in any society. However, it's not one of the primary reasons for India's high poverty rate. Richest 1% Indians hold close to 50% of India's wealth, and you would think this number is too high. Think about this. Richest 1% Americans hold 37% American wealth. Inequality is present in most of the developed world. India's problem is not of things shared unequally, but one of not enough things to share. The poorest 10% living in USA have better standard of living compared to poorest 10% of India. The real reasons behind poverty in modern India is bad governance, misplaced priority of development, and failure of providing quality healthcare and education to the poor. Doing business is very difficult in India due to regulatory hurdles and complex tax system. If you are unsure about what greater economic freedom does to a country, just look at the examples of East Germany and West Germany. While West Germany developed very quickly due to open markets and simple rules, East Germany remained poor due to less economic freedom. Recent examples are poor North Korea versus rich South Korea. Distrust of foreigners has kept Indian markets closed for far too long. Another reason of poverty is bad infrastructure. India's 40% population does not have proper access to healthcare, drinking water and sanitation. India does not have robust political and legal institutions. India's poor people lack access to formal finance institutions and have bad credit system in place. The path from developing to developed economies goes from agriculture to manufacturing and then to service-based economy. India leapfrogged directly from agriculture to service-based economy. Service-based economy can provide lesser employment compared to manufacturing-based economy, which is more labor-intensive. The result, India's 60% workforce is still employed in agriculture. This number is only 5% for developed countries. India needs to tick 3 boxes if it wants to reduce poverty: health and sanitation, education, and capitalism.